Vicky is a low-carb, high-fat dietitian. She is the co-founder of Eat, Play, Thrive, which is a centre, and Vicky's going to tell you her story as well, so I won't go too much into it. The thing I really love about Vicky, that I tend to feel I share the same experience, is that being a nurse myself for so many years, and then looking at, I guess, how we educate patients and clients and sort of staying, maybe what we're telling everybody for so many years isn't maybe bang on, and we're not quite getting the results that we really want to, has stirred in my stomach for a long time as a nurse. And then when I first got to hear Vicky's story, which she's going to tell you herself, I just went, wow, here's someone who's so brave and taking a step to go, maybe we need to look at this. Maybe we need to look at how the information we're giving people and how we're treating people's different illnesses from a different perspective. And to take that stance away from what the majority of population and healthcare professionals is saying is a really big jump for those of you that might have done it yourself. No. So without any more to do, please put your hands together for Vicky Kuriel.
Thank you, and thanks for being here and coming back after that lunch. Everybody enjoy the lunch? Yeah, I did. Great. So before I get started, let's get an idea of who here is with me. Anybody a low-carb, high-fat follower right now? Great. Good percentage of the room. Who is aware of low-carb but isn't quite, ready to take, or hasn't been, maybe after today you will be, ready to take steps? Yep. Who's got no idea what we're really talking about? Anybody fit into that? Oh, so you must have just been dragged along. Well, hopefully by the end of this, everybody will have a much better idea of what low-carb, high-fat is all about, because there's lots of misconceptions out there. What I also want to spend time talking about today, and I'm going to start off with this, is my journey. And I think it puts everything into perspective when I take you through how I began to, why I practice as a low-carb, high-fat dietitian. It wasn't just on a whim that I decided to do this. It really goes right the way back to my childhood when I think of it, why I practice the way I do today. So following a little bit about me, I'll then go on to give you my top 4 tips, and we'll go through those individually, and hopefully that will give you a little bit of how to get started on this way of eating. So to start things off, I actually grew up in South Africa. I lived in a household that was all about being healthy and fit. I have images of my childhood bike rides with the family, hiking up the local mountains, lots and lots of time spent outside, out in the great outdoors. I also have images of lots and lots of whole foods in our refrigerator. We ate whole food, we had whole full fat products, and you know what? We were all really healthy. My whole family, we were healthy. No one was overweight. No one suffered from any sort of lifestyle disease, diabetes or high blood pressure or cancer or dementia. My grandfather ended up dying from emphysema. And this was despite him never smoking a cigarette in his life, but sharing an office with a chain smoker for 30 years. And I digress for a second and say, many of the similarities we see now in the sugar industry and the food really mirrors what happened in the 50s with the tobacco industry. But, lucky for us, there's no such thing as secondary sugar inhalation, or we'd all be doomed. So I moved to Australia in my second year of study, or following my second year of study, and I came into the profession, the health and fitness industry, as a natural progression of my childhood. It's just what I always knew I was going to do. I studied 2 years in South Africa, lots of anatomy and physiology. I then moved out here and went to Monash and finished off a Bachelor of Science and then majored in exercise physiology. I then went off to Deakin University and did a Master's in Nutrition and Dietetics, followed by a postgraduate in sports nutrition. So I loved being at uni, quite clearly. But what really struck me from the moment that I started my university studies in nutrition was what was being preached, what was being taught to us was very different to what I had grown up involved in, you know. So the nutrition that I had been fed by my parents was not what we were being taught at university. And it sort of really plagued me for some time, but I sort of justified it, you know, telling myself I wasn't the one here with all the degrees, and all these people with all the degrees were telling me this information, and I was seeing it in journal articles, and this was constantly being fed to me time and time again, and so I needed to listen, you know, I should be taking all of it in. And so I did. And there were times where I was going, geez, that just doesn't sit well. But I sort of, most of the time, didn't question it, because the times that I did question things, I was shot down very quickly. And so I learnt my place, and I sort of sat back and just went with the flow of things for most of my university life. I then left uni and I started working, and I worked at a number of large hospitals here in Melbourne. And you know, I haven't been moving these along, but we won't need to go there. This is how I felt. This is how I felt working in these hospitals. I got to the point where I was so frustrated and embarrassed to be calling myself a dietitian. I really was. I knew that there needed to be another way. And then one day, I was working in a diabetic outpatient clinic at one of Melbourne's largest hospitals, sitting in my little cubicle room. And if any of you have been to a dietitian's office, you know, on my wall was the picture of the pyramid, and on my desk were Kellogg's packaging, cereals and other sorts of things from Nestle and goodness knows who else that I was meant to be promoting to my clients. So that's my office, and I walked out into the reception area, and there sitting was my next patient. And it was a 13-year-old boy, so overweight that you could just by looking at him see how uncomfortable he was. He had his chin on his chest and he was looking down, and that's how he sat for the entire consultation. My heart just sank when I went outside, because standing next to him was his dad, who was so large that he didn't even have the option of sitting in one of the reception seats. And these two came into my office, and the desperation in the dad's voice was heartbreaking. He had diabetes, his son at 13 had been diagnosed as pre-diabetic, and he was desperate. He had been following guidelines from Diabetes Australia. He told me about all the whole grain products that they ate, the low-fat diet that they followed, the products that they bought all had the tick on them. And you know, I knew without a shred of a doubt that everything that he was telling me right then and there was absolutely truthful, that that is what he was doing, and that was the result that it was giving them. And it was just that light bulb moment for me. And it was that changed everything for me. And I left that day and I decided to start doing my own reading and researching. And the more I read and the more I researched, the more I knew I could not continue to practice as a dietitian in this way. And so I left the profession. I threw in the towel, I left my job, left the dietetic profession, but my passion for nutrition never waned. And so I continued to research and read, And my poor husband just had to listen to me ranting and raving constantly. You know, every night we'd lie in bed and I'd say, I read this today and that today, and this is what should be happening, and blah, 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 and we'd go on and on. And then, you know, one day we were out for a run because we like to exercise together. It's often our catch-up time. We were out behind our house along Gardeners Creek Path, and we were running along, and off I was going again about how, you know, the pharmaceutical industry and the food industry and blah, 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 blah. And I'm running down, and next thing I realise, he's not next to me anymore. And I turn around, and he's standing, you know, a good 20, 30 metres down the track, and he's like, if it's all so bad, then just do something about it already. And I was like, I will. And that is what I did. I came back to the profession. Together we opened up our private practice studio, developed into multidisciplinary clinic now, Eat, Play, Thrive. And I started practicing again, but on my own terms. And one of my terms was that I took my membership of the Dietitians Association and crumpled it up and threw it back at them. I was not going to be a part of Dietitians Association of Australia if they were going to continue to make the dietitians under them promote a particular way of eating. Also, I didn't want to associate myself with an association that partnered with the likes of Unilever and Kellogg's, etc. And so this was all on my own terms. And, you know, because of it, I have created a lot of controversy and I have copped a lot of flack. And this is just a recent article that was in the Herald Sun here probably about 4 or 5 weeks ago. And I love this sort of stuff because it really gets their backs up and they hate it. And then they'll release something onto their website, a response. And I love reading the responses and sending them my response back because really I've got all the fuel that I need. I've got all the evidence in research, but I've also got the evidence from my patients, from which I now get amazing results. You know, type 2 diabetics who have come off their medication, type 1 diabetics who have HbA1cs lower than they've ever had on less insulin, people with irritable bowel syndrome who it's just disappeared, all sorts of things, weight loss stories, the list is endless. The results are there, and that is inspiring, and it inspires me in my practice every single day. And so I will continue to practice this way, regardless of what anybody else thinks. So, maybe you might be going, all right, this sounds all right. Where do I start? Is that maybe a question that everybody's going, okay, tell me where to begin? Yeah? Thinking where to start? Well, for me, what this really comes down to is this, JERF. When you really look at what low-carb, high-fat is, it is JERF. How you start it is with JERF. Just eat real food. That is it. When we eat real food, our diet ends up being lower in carbohydrate and higher in fat. Simple fact. This is my son and me on our weekly market trip. This is what we do every week as a family. The kids are involved. People go, yeah, well, I want to do it for myself, but you know, what about my kids? Is this okay for my kids? Of course it's okay for your kids. My kids have been eating this way for all their lives and they're as healthy as can be. So, what is real food? Real food is food that is available to us in nature. Can you pick it from a tree? Is it growing in the ground? Does it come from an animal? Or is it made in some sort of human processing plant that has to go through all sorts of mills and goodness knows what else? You know, when you read a package and there's all these ingredients on them and you're going, well, I don't even know what half of these are. You know, I study food. I read articles every day about food and journals. I don't even know what half of those things are. You know, that is not food. That is not stuff that we should be putting into our bodies if we want to live and be optimal in our living. So real food, stuff that you can identify. Always be able to identify what is on your plate. If you've got a chicken nugget, can you identify all parts? No, but if you've got a chicken drumstick, you know exactly what that is. So this is the most basic rule, and if you do nothing, but all you do is this, just eat real food, so many things will start improving for you. You know, your energy levels, the way you feel, the way you perform, all sorts of things. This is a great starting point for you, your household, your kids. When you eat real food, your fridge will be full and your pantry should only have a few things in it, not the other way around. Most of the stuff we find when we do the outskirts of the supermarket, we don't need to walk up and down the aisles. Or better yet, head out to a market. We are spoiled for choice here in Melbourne. Or go to a local farmer's market. They are popping up all over the place. These are the places where you find real food. Yes, it's going to take a little bit more effort to prepare. You know, you actually have to do some chopping and cutting and throwing things together. But we all have got to find, well, what are our priorities? What's important to us? What sort of choices do I need to make in order to move in the direction that I want to? So number one, just eat real food. The next thing, and Grant has spoke quite extensively about this. I think this has been spoken about quite a bit here today. I was down in one of the expo rooms, and Rob Szabo and Britt were speaking about this too. And this is understanding your carbohydrate requirements, because we are all different. You know, when I say go low carb for me is going to be very different low carb for you. There is a spectrum that exists here. So if we view this spectrum like this, on one side, down that end, is the weight loss population, or the population who has things that we classify under the heading of metabolic disease. Diabetes fits under there. These people are generally a lot more overweight, have hypertension, all of that sort of stuff. Down this end of the spectrum, these are our lean athletes. Carbohydrate requirements for people along the spectrum are going to differ, and that is key. All right, everybody is going to thrive on slightly different macronutrient ratios. So your weight loss population, this population is what we refer to as insulin resistant. I'm going to come back. And down this end, we've got the insulin sensitive. And I know that we've spoken here today about these terms, but I want to just drill it right back so that hopefully you leave here today really understanding what this all means. Are we all clear on what this hormone insulin is all about? Anybody who's clear, give me a yes. Okay, so that's about maybe a third of the room. Everybody else, we then want a little bit more of an estimation. Can I make this a little bit clearer for you? Would that be helpful? Yes, okay. So let's start with carbohydrate. Carbohydrate can start off as all sorts of things. You know, you can have a can of Coke, you can have a piece of bread, you can have some fruit, you can have some veggies, you can have some lollies. These foods all comprise carbohydrates. Now, when we eat anything that contains carbohydrate in it, it doesn't matter how it begins. Once you've eaten it, it goes into your stomach, it gets broken down, and it arrives in your bloodstream. It is always going to arrive as glucose. All right? So it starts off in all sorts of shapes and colours and forms, tastes different, arrives in your bloodstream, it is glucose. Now, as soon as glucose arrives in your bloodstream, your body wants to get it from your blood somewhere else, into your cells, okay? But glucose needs a little bit of help. It can't do this most of the time by itself. And the helper here is insulin, okay? So I'll draw a little picture to hopefully make this a little bit clearer. Here, you have your bloodstream. Here, you have a cell in your body. So you've eaten, and the glucose arrives here in your bloodstream, but your body wants to get it out of the bloodstream. Now, on your cell over here, you have these little things that we'll just draw like that, and we'll call these your receptors. So glucose arrives in your bloodstream. We got that. As that happens, insulin is released, because insulin is what we require to get the glucose from your blood into the cells. And what does insulin do? Insulin comes along and attaches onto these receptors. And it opens the gates. It opens the gates so that glucose can now flow into your cells. Is that making a little bit of sense? So insulin is absolutely vital in getting the glucose from your blood into your cells by way of attaching onto these little receptors. Now, if you are down this end of the spectrum, we have now said you are insulin resistant. What does that mean? It's talking about these little receptors. It is them who are resistant to the action of insulin. So when you secrete insulin to get the glucose from there to there, well, the insulin comes, attaches onto there, and do the gates open? No. So what do you have to do? You secrete some more. And then if you're really resistant, you keep secreting and you keep secreting, and your insulin levels are going through the roof. And the glucose slowly trickles into the cells. But in the meantime, you've just had this massive surge of insulin. If, however, you are the insulin-sensitive person, your glucose arrives, the insulin is secreted, bam, in it goes. And so the insulin levels drop back down. So there's this massive spectrum, and some people are secreting massive amounts of insulin, and other people not so much. But another word for being insulin resistant is carbohydrate intolerant. Because if you are this person who needs heaps and heaps and heaps of insulin to make this happen, you are carbohydrate intolerant. Your body does not want that carbohydrate in you because you cannot deal with it. And you are making yourself sicker and heavier and all those negative things because of it. You are carbohydrate intolerant, and therefore you need to limit, reduce, and almost sometimes completely take away the carbohydrate in your diet. So if you're the insulin-sensitive person, what happened? If you're the insulin-sensitive person, however, you are carbohydrate tolerant, and therefore you can have large amounts of carbohydrate and tolerate it because you'll just get rid of it really quickly and easily. But does that mean that the person who is carbohydrate tolerant should just eat massive amounts of carbohydrate? Is that your free ticket? If you're the skinny athlete, is that your free ticket to eat massive amounts of carbohydrate? Well, that's where I bring that word in, health. Because health sort of brings this whole spectrum together. Because even if you are more sensitive and therefore can tolerate more carbohydrate, it is really in your benefit from a health point of view to limit the amount of carbohydrate in your diet. If you do this, you will feel more satisfied, not as hungry as often, your energy levels will be more consistent, your chance of becoming insulin resistant as you age will be dramatically diminished. Your blood lipid profile will be better and healthier. All those sorts of things from a health point of view are going to be more beneficial. So the average Australian has around about, they estimate, 250 to 300 grams of carbohydrate per day. The insulin-sensitive person, what I sort of am recommending as a starting point, if you recognise that you are an insulin-sensitive person, you probably want to start somewhere between 80 and 120 grams of carbohydrate per day and see how that works for you. And then you can up or down it according to what's going on. But the insulin-resistant person, you probably need to be right down at about 30, 40, 50 grams of carbohydrate per day. Is that making sense for everyone? So does everybody, or should everybody be on a low carbohydrate diet? Everybody should be on a lower carbohydrate diet, absolutely. The extent of that restriction will vary considerably between individuals. Okay, next point is start with protein. Why am I saying start with protein? Now I want you, before we move on, because I'm going to throw in a few sciencey words, drop your pens, put your hands on your head, wiggle your toes, turn to the person next to you and say, I'm with her. All right, I was just checking that you're listening. So, why do I say start with protein? Because when we start with protein, we naturally introduce good animal fat into our diet. We all know about fat now. I'm not going into it because I'm already getting signs from the back to sort of wrap things up. But, you know, when we start with protein, and we start with good quality protein, and I'm not talking about the leanest cut of meat you can find, I'm talking about the chicken with the skin on, and I'm talking about a piece of meat with a big fat bit on the end of it. When we start with protein, we include fat there and then. So we're already incorporating fat. But also when we start with protein, and this is where, don't lose me, we're going to come across something called the leucine threshold. And this can be really important and a useful thing to know about. So when we eat, we've got our three macronutrients. We've got protein, carbohydrate, fat. Carbohydrate and fat should be used for fuel. Protein should not be. Protein should be used for things in our body that are part of what we call protein synthesis. So things like repair, regeneration, all of those sorts of processes is what we use protein for, what we should use protein for, not as a fuel, okay? But in order for protein to be used for protein synthesis, we have to have a very particular amount of it. If we have too little protein, we don't stimulate this thing called the leucine threshold. And then, if we haven't stimulated the leucine threshold, the protein that we've eaten is used for fuel. We don't want that to happen. It's extremely important to stimulate the leucine threshold, because then our protein goes off and is used for things like repair and regeneration and building and all of that sort of stuff. So what does this mean? Well, the leucine threshold in terms of numbers, in order to stimulate it, we need 30 grams of protein per meal. And I'm going to whiz through this because I'd like to give you some practicalities around what this actually means. So if you have a minimum of 30 grams of protein at a meal, you will stimulate the leucine threshold, which means you will allow protein synthesis to happen. Okay? Let's have a look. If you were going to have breakfast and you were trying to get 30 grams of protein and all you had for breakfast was 2 eggs, you wouldn't be anywhere close. You're only at 12 grams of protein. So we need to add stuff in. Remember, we're starting with protein. We start with the eggs. What other protein can we put in here? Bacon, yay. but we're still not quite there at 30 grams unless we had a little bit more of the bacon, so I like variety, so we throw in a bit of cheese. And now that combination gives us 31 grams of protein. I'm going through this quickly. For lunch, if we had 100 grams of chicken, we wouldn't be there yet. But we add a little bit of cheese, we add some pumpkin seeds or nuts or something like that, and all of a sudden we're at that 30 grams. And then for dinner, most people meet leucine threshold at dinner. Most people do not meet it at breakfast and lunch. And so, there we go, 150 grams of steak, put it any way you like, and there you go, you've got it. So if we start with protein and we aim for that 30 grams, what we've covered off is really beneficial in terms of the fat content too. And we've managed to keep carbohydrate low. So if you now consider carbohydrate and fat, and we look, okay, breakfast, we had, remember, the 2 eggs, the streaky bacon and cheese. They gave us already 26.5 grams of fat. Now, everybody's fat requirements are going to be slightly different, but if you know you need a little bit more to keep you satiated or to achieve your goals or whatever it might be, well, now you can add it. And you can add it through pure fats, such as avocado, cream, butter, whatever your choice is. Now we look at the carbohydrate component and we go, so far in all of that, we've only got 1.6 grams of carbs. If you're an insulin-sensitive person, well, then you can go for your life here and you can add really starchy veggies or things that are going to prop up that carbohydrate amount. But if you are an insulin-resistant person, well, then you're going to keep that low. You're going to add, green leafies and that sort of thing. So choose what fits into your sensitivity versus resistant range. And then we do this for lunch. And we've got the fat, and we add some others. We add in a little bit of dessert, maybe some strawberries and cream. And then we do the same thing for dinner with some additional fats and then some carbs to suit your own individual requirements. So what I'm saying here is that when you start with protein, it's easy to get the other two fitting in. When you start with a sandwich or breakfast cereal, it's just all wrong. All right. My last point, because I've got the time up, is timing of food intake. And this all goes back to that whole insulin thing again, because I know I said carbohydrates stimulate insulin, but unfortunately, everything stimulates insulin. So when we eat protein and fat, we also get an insulin response. Not as great as carbohydrate, but we still get a trickle of it coming in. So the thing is, whenever you eat, you get an insulin response. So if you ate 3 meals a day, you were a fairly insulin-sensitive person, you'd have an insulin surge, then you'd go back down, you'd have another one, you'd go back down. And what you want to note is that when you are insulin secreting, you are not able to burn fat. So your chance to burn fat comes when you have that time in between your meals and also overnight when you're sleeping. Now let's change this for a second. So this is 3 meals a day. Let's add in some snacks. So when you snack, your insulin goes up and then it's trying to come back down, but you add some snack in and so it starts going back up. And before it's able to get back down, you add your lunch. And then all day long you're doing this, and by the end of the day your insulin's through the roof, and you spend the whole night not burning fat. If there's one thing that is recommended mainstream that should just be abolished, it's this small frequent meal nonsense. Don't do it. Don't snack. If you can just go jerf and 3 meals per day, you'll be on the right track. So, in summary, guys, it is all about that. If you jerf, so if you just eat real food, you are naturally going to be having a diet that is higher in protein and higher in fat. When you eat more protein and fat, you don't feel as hungry, and therefore you don't need a snack. So there's the summary. I hope that has helped. I hope you can get started with that. If anybody wants to check out my blogs or follow us on Facebook or any of that, that's how to get in touch with me. Thank you for your time. It's been a pleasure.